The stars outside the ship's viewport shimmered like scattered diamonds in the vast emptiness of space. But James Archer's mind was focused on the mission ahead. The alien planet looming closer. The Queen's face flashed across his mind, her royal features marred by the marks of captivity, her once regal posture now hunched and broken in the clutches of the tyrannical alien king. This was his assignment, a rescue mission, a silent strike against an empire that had crushed countless worlds under its heel. His ship was small, nothing special, a relic of humanity's military tech, a stealth vessel designed for speed and subtlety. It was perfect for the mission, but it wouldn't hold up against a full-on assault from the alien fleet. If the king realized the Queen was missing before he could escape, the chase would be relentless. There was no margin for error. The Queen was kept in a palace surrounded by the most brutal of guards, and he would have to navigate the labyrinthine corridors to reach her. But he had trained for this. He had survived worse. The comms crackled with a faint signal from command, the voice of his superior urging him to stay sharp. The situation was tense. They knew the king was preparing for a retaliation, and once the Queen was gone, all bets were off. He would need to act fast and leave no trace of his presence behind. The plan was simple in theory: infiltrate, extract, and vanish into the night. But nothing ever went according to plan. When dealing with the unknown, the human race had learned it the hard way. When they first encountered the alien species, they thought they were prepared. They thought their firepower and ingenuity would be enough to match anything thrown at them. But they were wrong. The first conflict had been a disaster. Humanity was thrown into a desperate fight for survival, and it was only by the skin of their teeth that they held their ground. Now, years later, they had learned to fight smarter, to be more than just soldiers. They had learned to outthink their enemies, to use their own underestimation of humanity as a weapon against them. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered the atmosphere of the alien world. The red hue of the planet's surface spread across the viewport like blood spilled onto the canvas of space. It was a harsh world, a place of brutal beauty twisted by the alien king's rule. The gravity was heavier than Earth's, and the air thick with strange gases that would suffocate a human without proper filtration. But James had been prepared for this too. The atmosphere would not be his enemy today. The alien king would. The drop zone was just ahead, a secluded area on the outskirts of the palace where the Queen was being held. He had studied the schematics. Every inch of the complex was mapped out in his mind. He would have only a few minutes to reach the Queen before the alarms were raised. The moment his boots hit the ground, he would be in enemy territory, no turning back. He gripped the controls tighter as the ground neared, the tension rising in his chest. He was human, and in this galaxy that meant he had to fight for everything. He wanted nothing would ever be handed to him, not survival, not victory, and certainly not the life of the Queen. But that was why he was here, because humanity had something the rest of the galaxy had overlooked: a drive, a will that could never be extinguished. And today it would light the path to victory. The ship touched down with a soft thud, the landing gear absorbing the shock as James quickly unstrapped himself from the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. As he initiated the stealth mode, the hum of the engines faded into silence, leaving only the steady beat of his heart in his ears. He moved swiftly, grabbing his gear and checking it once more before slipping into the hatch and onto the alien soil. The air was thick and acrid, but his helmet's filtration system kicked in immediately, the strange smells of the planet mixing with the faint buzz of distant alien machinery. He surveyed the area quickly, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement in the pale red landscape. The drop zone was clear for now, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The Queen was a prize too valuable to be left unguarded, and he was too close to her to make a mistake. He crouched low, moving toward the palace, where the Queen was held prisoner. The stone walls loomed ahead of him like dark sentinels, his breath steady, his steps soundless, his mind focused on the task ahead. As he neared the palace's outer walls, he could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Every second that passed was a second closer to being discovered, and he couldn't afford to be discovered. Not now, not when he was so close to his goal. He reached the edge of the first defensive perimeter, a series of alien turrets hidden in the rock formations that surrounded the palace. He disabled them quickly with a small EMP device, sending them into a temporary shutdown. There was no room for hesitation here. He had no time to waste. Inside the palace, The air was stifling with tension. Alien guards patrolled in a routine that James had studied for weeks. He knew their movements, their shifts, their weaknesses, and as he moved deeper into the palace corridors, he slipped past each guard unnoticed like a shadow. His every movement calculated, his heart pounding with adrenaline, but his mind cold and clear. There would be no mistakes. Finally, he reached the holding chambers where the Queen was imprisoned. The door was reinforced with thick alien metal, but he had expected that too. A quick charge of his plasma cutter, and the door was breached. With a soft hiss, he slipped inside. The Queen was there, shackled to a wall, her pale blue skin bruised from the torment she'd endured, her eyes wide and filled with fear when they met his gaze. But there was something else there too, something new, hope perhaps, or maybe just the flicker of disbelief that someone had come for her. James moved quickly, pulling out his weapons to clear the immediate area of any guards. Before turning his attention to the Queen, he approached her slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. He had no time to waste, but he needed to make sure she understood he wasn't a threat. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and calm as he moved to release her shackles, his eyes never leaving hers. She stared at him for a long moment, as though unsure whether to believe him, but then her face softened slightly as she allowed herself to trust him. She was weak, exhausted, but there was strength in her, still strength James hadn't expected to see in a prisoner, not from the aliens who had once ruled the stars. Before he could say anything more, the door to the chamber burst open and alien guards, flooded in weapons, raised. James had no time to think. He grabbed the Queen by the arm, pulling her behind him as he aimed his blaster and fired. The ship shot through the atmosphere like a bullet, leaving the planet below them. As the sky outside grew darker and the stars slowly returned to their steady glow, James breathed a sigh of relief. But his eyes never left the controls, his fingers moving deftly over the navigation systems. He kept the ship on course, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking of the Queen. Her presence at his side was a constant reminder of what they had just accomplished, but also of the danger that still loomed ahead. The Queen sat in the co-pilot seat, her eyes scanning the ship's interior, her movements slow and deliberate as she tested her freedom for the first time in what felt like forever. The chains that had bound her were gone, and in their place was a quiet but undeniable strength. She glanced over at James, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged with an unspoken understanding. "Thank you," her voice was soft but firm, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since their escape. Her words held weight, more than just gratitude. There was respect in them, and something more, a recognition of what had just happened, what he had done for her. James didn't look at her immediately, his focus still on the controls, but he heard the sincerity in her voice. He could feel it in the air, and it made him pause for just a second before replying. "You don't owe me anything." His voice was calm and steady as always, but there was something in the way he said it that made the Queen reconsider. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You risked your life for me." Her words were measured and deliberate, as if weighing the significance of each one. "Your people don't know us, we're nothing to you, yet you still came for me. Why?" James took a deep breath, his eyes flickering to the stars outside as they soared further into space, the vastness of it all pressing against them. He let the silence settle around them for a moment before answering, because it was the right thing to do. His voice was quiet, but there was no doubt in his words. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer just because we're different." The Queen was silent for a moment, as though processing his words. Her gaze shifted back to the stars outside her mind, undoubtedly racing through the events that had unfolded. She had been a prisoner for so long, trapped by the very empire that had once ruled over her, and yet here was this human offering her freedom without asking for anything in return. "Humans are different," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Your kind don't see the world the same way we do." James glanced at her, then a hint of a smile on his lips. "We're not perfect, far from it, but when it comes down to it, we know what it means to fight for something that matters." His eyes met hers then, and there was something there, something that connected them, something that was more than just their shared moment of survival. "And you matter." The Queen was quiet again, and for the first time since he had rescued her, she looked at him, not as a human and an alien, But as two beings who had fought for each other in the face of impossible odds, her face softened, her voice steady when she spoke again. "I never thought anyone would fight for me." "You were wrong," James replied, his gaze never leaving the stars ahead. "Someone always will." As the ship sped farther from the planet, the danger was far from over, but in that moment, the Queen knew that whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The stars outside were a blur of white and blue as the ship sped through the vastness of space. The Queen leaned back in her seat, her eyes still on the viewport, as she tried to process everything that had just happened. Her mind was reeling from the sudden shift in her world, from prisoner to free woman, and from a captive of a king to the companion of a human soldier. James kept his focus on the controls, his hands steady as the ship hummed beneath them. The journey was far from over, and though they were out of immediate danger, he knew the worst was yet to come. The alien king would not take the loss of his queen lightly, and soon they would be hunted across the stars. He didn't need to look at the Queen to know she was deep in thought. He could feel the weight of the silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes when two people are on the same page, even if they didn't yet fully understand each other. He broke the silence, first his voice low and serious. "We'll need to make a jump soon. We can't afford to stay on this course for long." The Queen turned to him at the sound of his voice, her expression hard to read. "Do you think they'll find us?" Eventually, James said, his tone matter of fact. "They have a fleet, and they'll be looking for you, especially once they realize you're gone." "And what will you do then?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge of fear underneath. "Run," James replied without hesitation, "and fight if it comes to that. We'll find a way to stay ahead of them long enough to get you somewhere safe." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to measure him, trying to figure out why he was so certain, so willing to risk everything for her, a stranger to him, a prisoner of an empire that had long since decimated her people. "You don't know what they'll do to you," she said finally, her voice soft yet heavy with the weight of experience. "The king is ruthless. He won't stop until he has me back, and he won't hesitate to burn entire worlds to find me." James's eyes flicked to hers, then a flicker of something there in his gaze, something that was more than just resolve, it was understanding. "I know what it's like to fight against something bigger than you." His voice was quieter now as he leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on his lap. "I've seen entire colonies wiped out by forces they couldn't possibly defeat, and I've lost people I loved to things I couldn't stop. But I learned that if you stop fighting, you lose everything, and I'm not about to lose this fight." The Queen's breath caught at his words, and for the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear or anger. She allowed herself to feel hope, a fragile but real thing that she had long since abandoned. "You're not like them," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as she looked at him. "The humans I've known have always been like the king. They are conquerors, not protectors. But you're different. You fight for something else." James smiled then, though it was small and tired. It was genuine. "We all have our reasons for fighting," he said. "Maybe this is mine." His eyes returned to the stars ahead as the ship continued its journey deeper into the unknown. The Queen looked at him for a long moment, then nodded to herself, as if something inside her had clicked into place. She wasn't alone anymore, and that thought gave her a strength she hadn't felt in years. She would survive this. She would fight with him, not just for her life, but for the chance to see her people free again. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something she thought was long gone, something that felt like victory. The quiet hum of the ship's engines was a constant presence as they hurtled through the void of space. The tension between them was palpable. Neither of them spoke for a while, both lost in their thoughts, the Queen staring out at the endless expanse of stars as James focused on the controls. But the silence was heavy. It wasn't the calm before a storm, but the aftermath of one. They had escaped the palace. They had gotten away from the king's forces for now, but the weight of what was coming hung over them like a shadow. James knew it wasn't just about keeping the Queen safe anymore. It was about survival for both of them. The king wouldn't let this go, and the war that had been brewing between their people would only escalate the moment he found out she was missing. "We need to plan our next move," James said, finally breaking the silence, his voice low but firm. The Queen turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable for a moment, as if she were deciding whether or not to trust him fully. She had always been a leader, a ruler used to holding the reins of her own fate, but now she found herself at the mercy of a human soldier who had given her a chance at freedom. But she couldn't deny the strength she had seen in him, the way he had fought for her without hesitation, the way he still fought for her now. "You're right," she said slowly, "but we can't keep running forever. If we keep moving like this, we'll never be able to strike back." James glanced at her, then his fingers hovering over the ship's controls, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he repeated, but then a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "So we fight." The Queen raised an eyebrow. At that, her gaze hardening. "You don't understand how powerful the king is. He controls fleets of ships, entire armies. We can't just show up and fight them head on." "I know," James said, his voice steady, "but you're not just a queen now. You're a symbol, a target for their power, but also a rallying point for everyone who's tired of living under that tyranny. I've seen it before. People will rise if they believe there's something to fight for." "They won't rise for me," she said, shaking her head. "My people are divided. My reign ended long before I was captured. The king's power has fractured the empire into warring factions. No one will trust me." "You'd be surprised," James replied, his eyes locking with hers. "People don't follow power for the sake of it. They follow because they believe in what that power stands for. They follow because they believe in hope. You just need to show them that you're worth following, that you're more than a victim of the king's rule." The Queen looked at him for a long moment. The idea of leading again, something she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years, the weight of that responsibility heavy on her shoulders. But there was something in James's words, something in his eyes that made her want to believe him. Maybe she had been wrong to think that the fight for her people was lost. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Why are you doing this for me? What is it that you want?" James's smile faded for a moment. As he considered her question, his gaze drifting to the stars ahead, his voice quieter now. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe it's because I've seen too much destruction, too much suffering to walk away from this one. Maybe I'm fighting because it's the right thing to do." She was silent for a moment before speaking again, her voice quiet but resolute. "Then let's make sure we fight for something worth it." James's eyes met hers again, and this time there was no hesitation in his gaze. "We will," he said simply, and with that they both knew the next phase of their fight had begun. The escape was only the first step. The real battle was still ahead of them, and it would take everything they had to survive it. The silence stretched between them again, as the stars rushed past the ship like forgotten memories. James focused on the instruments before him, adjusting their course slightly to avoid a large asteroid field ahead. They were heading toward a distant moon, an uninhabited rock that would give them the perfect place to regroup and plan their next move. The Queen remained quiet beside him, her gaze fixed on the viewport, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. James glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. He could see the strain in her features, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She had been a queen once, but now she was something else, a symbol of rebellion in a galaxy torn apart by war. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been for either of them. "We're almost there," James said, breaking the silence, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of tension. The Queen nodded without looking at him. "Good," she replied, her tone measured, her mind clearly elsewhere, her hands folded in her lap. As she considered their options, the escape had been successful, but now came the hard part, getting her people to rise up against the king's forces, and that wasn't something she could do alone. They had to find allies, but even that was no easy task. The alien empire was vast and divided, but the king's grip on power was still firm enough that anyone who opposed him was at risk of being eradicated without mercy. James knew that he couldn't do this alone either. As they neared the moon, the ship's sensors pinged, and James frowned, tapping a few controls as a small dot appeared on the radar screen, a ship approaching fast. It wasn't one of the king's forces, not immediately recognizable, but it was too close for comfort. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath, as he adjusted the ship's speed to avoid detection. But it was too late. The ship had already locked onto their coordinates, and it was closing in fast. The Queen straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. As she looked at the readings, her expression hardening. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. James's fingers danced over the controls as he tried to gain a better reading on the ship's signature. It didn't match any of the known military vessels from the King's fleet, but it was heavily armed and maneuvering with purpose. "I don't know, but we can't afford to find out," he said, glancing at her. "Brace yourself." Before she could respond, he hit the thrusters, and the ship lurched forward with a burst of speed, sending them into a sharp, evasive maneuver as the unknown ship closed in. The proximity alert blared loud in the cockpit as James weaved and dodged through the field of asteroids, desperately trying to shake the pursuing ship. "They're not giving up," the Queen said through clenched teeth, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that had started to course through her veins. She had been trained to lead armies, not escape from attacks like this. "No, they're not," James said grimly as he pulled the ship into a narrow gap between two large asteroids. But the enemy ship was still on their tail, its weapons flashing as it fired blasts at their ship, sending jolts of energy through the hull. The ship rocked violently as one of the blasts hit the rear stabilizer, causing a warning light to flash on the dashboard. James cursed under his breath. "We've got damage," he said quickly. "Hold on." The Queen's grip tightened on her seat, her eyes wide, as the ship careened through the asteroid field. But she didn't say a word. She trusted him. They both knew the odds were against them. But there was no turning back now. Their only choice was to fight or die trying. The sound of the enemy ship's engines roaring behind them filled the cockpit like a predator closing in for the kill, and for the first time since their escape, James felt the weight of what they were up against. The King's forces would stop at nothing to get the Queen back, and this fight was just beginning. The ship rocked again as another blast hit its side, the hull groaning under the pressure. The stars outside were nothing more than streaks of light as James twisted the controls, sending them into a sharp roll, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire that erupted from the ship behind them. His hands were moving fast, his eyes locked onto the asteroid field ahead, calculating every movement. He could hear the enemy ship's engines getting closer, the growl of its weapons charging for another shot. "We can't keep dodging forever," James muttered to himself, his teeth clenched as he pushed the ship even harder. The Queen remained silent, her eyes scanning the controls before her, her mind racing through possibilities. She knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They needed a plan, something that would buy them enough time to escape, or at the very least make the enemy think twice about chasing them. "We need to hit back," she said finally, her voice calm but resolute. James didn't look at her immediately, but his lips twitched upward in a half-smile. "I was hoping you'd say that," he replied as he glanced at the radar. The enemy ship was closing in on them, but they were approaching a small moon on the outer edge of the asteroid field. It was rocky and uncharted, the perfect place for a counterattack. He pulled the ship into a sharp dive, heading toward the surface of the moon. He knew they had to be quick and unpredictable if they had any hope of turning the tables on their pursuer. The enemy ship followed them down into the moon's atmosphere, its weapons firing at the ship with reckless abandon. The Queen could feel the heat from the blasts as they narrowly missed their hull. She gripped the seat tightly, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus on their surroundings. "We need to split them up," she said after a moment, her mind working through the strategy. "If we can make them believe we're going in opposite directions, we might have a chance to shake them off." James glanced at her, then his expression grim, but with a glint of determination. "I'll make it work," he said as he pressed a button on the dashboard, triggering the ship's emergency flares. The red lights flashed as the ship split into two directions, one diving toward a canyon, while the other shot up into a narrow ravine. The enemy ship hesitated for just a moment before following the first trail. The ploy was working. They were being led into a trap, but James had to make sure they didn't anticipate the second part of the plan. "Get ready," James warned as the ship in the canyon leveled out, narrowly missing the jagged walls around them. They were in the perfect spot now, just a little further. The Queen's eyes were sharp as she reached for the controls. She had no experience flying the ship, but in that moment she was as focused as she had ever been, her voice low but full of intent. "I'll draw their fire. You hit them with everything you've got." James didn't need to ask twice. He gripped the controls and shifted the ship into a steep climb as he adjusted the targeting systems for the enemy ship behind them. His hands flew over the console as he fired a series of missiles straight at the enemy vessel, sending the explosions reverberating through the space around them, the shockwaves rattling the ship. The enemy ship was hit hard, but it wasn't destroyed yet. The Queen's plan was working, but they needed to finish the job. James kept his focus as the enemy ship lurched slightly. It was weakened, but it was still in pursuit. They weren't out of danger yet, and the next few moments would decide everything. The enemy ship staggered slightly, its course erratic after the missile strike. But it wasn't out of the fight, yet James knew they couldn't waste any time. The seconds ticking by felt like hours. As he calculated their next move, the enemy would recover soon, and if they didn't finish this now, they would have no chance of escaping. "We need to finish it now," James said, his voice tight with urgency as he gripped the controls tighter. The ship shuddered beneath them from the previous hits, but it was still functional, just barely. The Queen's gaze was fixed on the enemy ship now. It was circling them, carefully trying to regain its position. She could see the determination in its movements. It would be back on them any moment, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. "They're too close," she said, her voice cold but steady as she reached for the secondary weapons panel. She had never been trained in battle, but in that moment she was no different from the warriors of her people in the days of their strength. Her hands were steady, her mind focused. "Let's make them regret following us." James glanced at her and nodded in approval. "You're right," he said, turning his attention back to the controls. He adjusted the power flow to the weapon systems as the ship groaned under the stress. "Get ready, this is going to be close." With a sudden move, he pulled the ship into a sharp dive again, the momentum carrying them downward toward the surface of the moon. The enemy ship followed their every move with a vengeance, its weapons firing in quick succession, but James was leading them into a blind spot. The terrain ahead was treacherous, jagged, and full of obstacles that would give them the edge. As the ship neared a sharp cliffside, James veered hard to the left, sending the ship into a rapid roll. The enemy ship tried to match their move, but it wasn't quick enough. It collided with the cliff face, just slightly throwing off its trajectory, but it was enough. Now the Queen's voice rang out through the ship, the intensity in her tone unmistakable as she slammed her hand onto the weapons system. The secondary cannons on the ship opened fire in a barrage of rapid shots that slammed into the enemy ship's weakened hull. The explosions were deafening, and the enemy ship jerked violently under the assault. James pulled the ship up sharply to avoid the debris flying off the enemy vessel. As it started to break apart, the smoke from the explosions filled the air, but there was no mistaking the sight of the enemy ship losing its stability and spiraling out of control. It was falling into the atmosphere of the moon like a broken star. "We did it," James said as he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized. He was holding his hands, still gripping the controls, but with a visible relief washing over him. The Queen let out a quiet sigh as she leaned back in her seat, her eyes still fixed on the plummeting wreckage of the enemy ship. She hadn't allowed herself to feel hope until now, but the adrenaline was wearing off, and she could feel the weight of what they had just accomplished settle in. "You fought well," she said quietly, her voice softer now as she turned her head to him. "Both of us." James gave her a small smile despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "We make a good team," he said as he turned the ship's course back toward the safe zone. The damage to their own ship was still considerable, but they had won this battle. For now, they were safe, but neither of them could forget that the war had only just begun. The king would not rest until he had his queen back, and with every victory they won, the more dangerous the stakes would become. But in that moment, both of them understood something else. They weren't just running anymore, they were fighting together, and no matter how impossible the odds seemed, they would keep fighting.